All right, good morning again. I'm still wearing my coats from last week. How can you imagine that? Well, I've been at camp. So, in a camp, you don't take baths and stuff like that. Campers, you have to take them out in the rainstorm and get them to take a bath and stuff. But anyway, a good week upstate, almost into New York, in Tioga County, up there where Wellsboro is, in the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon. I've been doing camps up there at His Thousand Hills for over 30 years. And I still drive back up there. Come my grandchildren along, and they have to obey me there. They don't have to obey me at home. But up there they got to obey me because I'm in charge and stuff. But anyway, we're back from there, and we're looking again at the international lesson. And this week it's taken from Acts 26, verses 1 through 11. This is where Paul is making his defense. It's his third time. He's recited his conversion story on 3 different occasions, and this is the third time. He's talking to a man named King Herod Agrippa. Now, in our lesson, he's only referred to as King Agrippa, but he's a great-grandson of Herod the Great. Now, when we look at Herod the Great, there was a saying around his time: it was safer to be a pig than it was to be a wife of Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa went through many wives. When I say went through them, he went through them with a knife. He was a very difficult man. But he built the temple that Jesus worshipped at. It really didn't get finished until after his death. But he commissioned it, and he was the first one that really put in a court for the Gentiles, where Jesus turned over the money changers and all that. That didn't exist in earlier temples, but he put that court of the Gentiles in there. Now, it got abused. There were people who were walking through it and carrying bundles because it was a shortcut to the other side of the city. So all that happened. But he is the king. Now, Paul is arrested. We go back a couple of chapters, and Paul is arrested in about chapter 22, and he's taken by the governor to Caesarea. He's in the temple in Jerusalem, and they arrest him. The Roman soldiers come in, and there's a disturbance, a riot going on, and the Fortress Antonia is built right next to the temple. It has even a set of stairs coming down into the temple area, into the court of the Gentiles, and all that. So because there have been riots before, and so he has this built right there with the new thing. So the soldiers come in and they arrest Paul. They see what's that. They arrest him as much to protect him as anything else, because the people wanted to stone him for desecrating the temple. Now you got to remember, he's in the court of the Gentiles. Now he's taken a vow, which is part of what he's doing, not cutting his hair, not drinking wine, doing all that. But he's in there with what they think are Gentiles. They can be there in the court of the Gentiles, but they're saying Paul's going to take them into the court of Israel. And that could be even beyond. You can't even go to the court of women, let alone the court of Israel. Only Jewish women could go into there. And there was a big sign: "Enter not here on threat of death if you are not a Hebrew or an Israelite." So that was there. So he's arrested and he's taken before Festus, the governor. And Festus has him taken up to Caesarea, which is really the political headquarters on the Mediterranean Ocean. And he hears Paul's story. And he listens to it and he says, okay. Well, he leaves. He's replaced by Felix as governor. And Festus tells him, I've got this Paul in prison here. I don't know what to do with him. So Felix listens to it. Here's story number 2 of what it's all about. And Paul tells it again. A little bit different each time you get the story. A little bit different. Not that Paul's fudging on it, but when you tell a story, sometimes you remember other things than what you remember in the first time. But he's talking about his conversion. And so he listens. And then he's put in jail. Okay? For a long time again. A long time. 2 years he ends up being in jail. There. Then Felix says to him, "Paul, where are you from?" Well, Paul says, "I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia." "Oh, you're from way up there." Okay. Well, that's Herod Agrippa's territory. So I'm going to have him listen to you. Now, this is Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa I was in rule at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. He's the one on that. Now, he's not the one at Jesus' birth. That's a different Herod there, too. But he's at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And he's the one that has James put to death. You read about that in the book of Acts, too, that he has James put to death. That's this Herod Agrippa's son. This is Herod Agrippa II. And he's reigning in his father's place, grandfather's place on that. They jump around. If you could look at the family tree and say, who in the world is related to who and how many? Because Herod had about 5 wives, and he had different sons and such by each of them. And it's a crazy situation. But anyway, he has it. Now, what I'm looking at here is Paul's attitude. And that's the key thing in that. Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and began to defend himself. "I consider myself fortunate that to be before you, King Agrippa. I am to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, because you are especially familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." That's not always like Paul. Paul does not always say, "I'm fortunate to talk to you." Paul sometimes, most times, "You better listen to me because I know what I'm talking about." And he says, "I beg you to listen to me patiently." We call that tact. Being able to say something tactfully. And in modern language, it means being able to say you disagree with the person agreeably. And that's what Paul is going to do here. He didn't always do it that way, but he's going to do it here. Aretha Franklin. Some of you will remember Aretha Franklin, and that means you're old as I am. And that's old. Aretha Franklin was a great gospel singer. Her daddy was a preacher. But she was a rock and roll singer too. And she had a song called R-E-S-P-E-C-T, Respect. And she's in that song says, I have trouble getting some R-E-S-P-E-C-T, from the men in her life. They didn't respect her. And another man wrote a book called Love and Respect. And in the book he talks about Paul's statement to men to love their wives, and wives' responsibility to respect their husband. Now, in a sense, if you love somebody, you'll respect them, and if you respect them, you'll love them. They go hand in hand, maybe like a right and left hand. That doesn't mean because you respect them that you necessarily like everything about them. That doesn't mean that. My mother loved me, but she sure didn't like everything about me. And such. And there were times when she would respect me, and there were times when I didn't deserve her respect. But she talks about respect, and that's what Paul is showing here. Now I want to look at a couple of things that show that about him. All right. All the Jews know my way of life from my youth, a life spent from the beginning among my own people. Okay, and in Jerusalem. Paul grew up in Tarsus, and he will talk about his being the son of a Pharisee, and his grandfather a Pharisee, and that they were educated. He grew up in Jerusalem. Now, he doesn't say it here, but if you go to one of the other stories, he said, I grew up in Jerusalem under the teaching of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the #1 teacher in the Hebrew world at the time of Paul. If you studied under Gamaliel, you studied under the best. So it was like he went to boarding school at Yale, if we talk about in this country, or at Rugby in England. Those were boarding schools where the best and the richest kids went. So Paul was saying, I had the best training that you could ever want. In terms of that. Spent from the beginning among my own people and in Jerusalem. They have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that I belong to the strictest sect of our religion and lived as a Pharisee. And now I stand here on trial on account of my hope in the promise made by God to our ancestors. here's Paul identifying with his people in that, okay? A promise that our 12 tribes hope to attain. For this hope, Your Excellency, I am now accused by the Jews. Why is it thought incredible that God raises the dead? Indeed, I myself convinced of that. Now, he goes on to say, he recites his conversion in that and stuff. And I'm looking for where he says, he identifies with oh my goodness, with Herod Agrippa. He said, I saw it before there, but he said, oh, okay, here it is. Indeed, I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things against the name of Jesus. And that is what I did in Jerusalem with authority received from the chief priests. I not only locked up many of the chief priests, I not only locked up many of the saints in prison, but I also cast my vote against them when they were being condemned to death. In other words, he's saying, I was guilty. You know, and he uses the word we, and I don't spot it right there, right off the hand. But you know, just like his great-grandfather, or his grandfather, he killed Christians. I mean, his grandfather killed Stephen, the first martyr, had ordered, James, I'm sorry, not Stephen, but James killed, and you read about that, I think, in chapter 12. And it caused a great exodus from Jerusalem because people were scared, and so they fled out of Jerusalem. But he talks about we. In other words, he's willing to identify himself as being one of the bad guys. I did this. I'm not a perfect saint. I did some wrongs. Later on, he will also talk about making mistakes regarding some of his early associates. He traveled with Barnabas and John Mark. It became such an argument when Barnabas wanted to take Mark on a second journey that Paul said, I'm done with you. We're going separate ways. And he took Silas and went. Now, later on when he writes, he will say, Mark is a great help to me. But that's a mellowed Paul. That's a Paul who has learned to have to deal with some things. And some of those things came along when he preached at Athens. He fell flat on his face. He thought he could talk to them about their own religion, and that fell flat. He went on to Corinth, and he said, as he wrote to the Corinthians, I said I would know nothing among you except Christ and Him crucified. In other words, I'm not going to try to be philosophical. I'm going to, see, at Athens, he said, I want to talk to you about this unknown God. I'm coming here to reveal Him to you. They laughed at him. They called him a lunatic, this foolish man. He went to Corinth, and then when he left Corinth, what happened, we're not sure, but people came in and they started putting down Paul. And so when he writes the Corinthian letters, he's hurt. People are questioning his apostleship, and he tries to defend it. There are people there that are saying, I'm of Apollos. Others are saying, I'm of Peter. Others saying, I'm of Christ. And Paul says, wait a minute, this is not what the church is supposed to be. He's hurt by it because he started the church there, and now they've rejected him, and it hurts. You know, that's a Paul that hurts. He heals, and he becomes more tender. Sometimes it takes some hurt to make us tender. I remember seeing my mother take a tool and beat the meat, and she called it tenderizing it. I thought of killing it. You know, she's beating this thing with things that had points in it, and she's making it, but boy, did that make that meat tender to eat. And so it broke down all the tendons and muscles and made it fall apart when it was cooked. Well, sometimes it hurts, tenderizes. Sometimes it makes us bitter and hardens us. But that's part. But Paul learned to say we, and not just you. He could include himself with others who struggled. That's an important thing in being able to share. I think I told you weeks ago about Damien, the Belgian priest that went to Hawaiian Islands, and he particularly ended up among the lepers in the leper colony in Malachi. And he contracted leprosy. And so he didn't talk about you lepers, he talked about us lepers. And that's an important thing, is that we identify with those with whom we are in ministry. Because we put our shoes on the same way and we put our pants on the same way. Well, I don't know. I've gotten to an age now where I have to lean against the bed to put my pants on, because I'll fall over if I don't. I hope you don't have to do that. But I get a little topsy there. And I haven't drunk anything, I just got up, but I haven't gotten my balance yet. So I lean against the bed, and sometimes I sit on the bed and put them on, because I don't want to fall on the floor. It's just no fun on that. So there are things that we have to give up. Well, all right, the second thing Paul talks about, and he talks about that in his second letter of Corinthians, not so much the first letter, but the second letter, he talks about being reconciled to one another. And that's what Paul was, when he was first arrested. As you read it in Acts, Ananias is the high priest, and he comes to interrogate him. Now, we don't understand why Paul didn't recognize him as high priest, but he didn't. And the high priest says, I ought to have you stoned. And Paul comes back with a word that he probably shouldn't have come back with. He says, you whitewashed sepulcher. In other words, you're nothing but a gravestone of dead bones and stuff. And then somebody said to him, Paul, how can you speak such to the high priest? And Paul says, I didn't know he was the high priest. I shouldn't have done that. And then he quotes the phrase from Exodus, which says, you shall not put down your leaders. And so it was kind of like an apology. That's Paul saying I'm sorry. And it goes on to be much better for him after he did that. When people heard him say that, it was much better. Now, he will talk about being reconciled to one another. That's kind of picking up on what Jesus said. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, if you come to, we would say, if you come to church and you have something against somebody, or somebody has something against you, you ought to go and get that straightened out before the church service. And when I was in Oklahoma, I had my Indian church. I had a number of people in different tribes in there, mostly Comanches and Kiowas, but Cherokee too. But I remember this one woman stood up in church. We were having communion, and she said, I have to set this straight. And he named the other woman. She named the other woman. And she said, I've been angry at her, and I want to get it straightened before I take communion. I'd never seen that done before. But in the old ritual of the church, it says, you who are live in harmony with your neighbor and intend to lead a new life following the commandments of God, draw near with faith and take His Holy Communion to your strength and healing. Well, I think that's a good statement. And Jesus said that we should forgive. If somebody has something against us, go and seek it out. Tell them I'm sorry. I tell people, just because you said you're sorry doesn't mean you're at fault. It's just that you're sorry there's a broken relationship. And if you are at fault, you want to make it right. I hear people at funerals say, oh, I'm so sorry your husband died. Well, you're not taking blame for killing him. You're saying you have feelings that are caring about this person. And you're not saying, I have just as bad feelings as you have right now. That's not very caring. It just says, I'm sorry that you're hurting. And I wish I could take it away, but we can't. But the reconciliation is there. Psalms 133 talks about it. It says how good it is when brothers dwell together in unity. And it is good. I saw it in my family with arguments and stuff where my dad and uncle wouldn't talk to each other for years. Wouldn't talk to each other. And it was it hurt the whole family. It didn't hurt just them, it hurt the whole family. Now, finally they were reconciled. They weren't buddy-buddy. I have to say that. But they were reconciled. They could talk to one another. They could care. Even if they disagreed, they could care. Now, they didn't seek each other out and all that stuff, but it was much better. And when my dad died, my uncle was at the funeral. And us kids were at his funeral. He had no children, but his nephews and nieces were at his funeral. And that was important. That was a good feeling. Be reconciled. The other thing that I want to mention very quickly is that Paul uses his Roman citizenship He doesn't use it just as a trump, but he uses it when he sees it's going to help his ministry. Paul wanted to get places, and when things were turning against him, and there was a possibility that he could be stoned, although Agrippa comes along at the end of this chapter and says, you know, we could have freed Paul if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. But his appeal to Caesar goes over our judgment, because we work for Caesar. So Paul had appealed, which a Roman citizen could do. I appeal to Caesar to be judged by Caesar. See, they were going to whip him. And he said, you can't whip me. Now, it had happened before. They whipped him at Philippi. And he sent word, I'm a Roman citizen. You guys are in trouble. They were. You can't whip a Roman citizen. And, so here was the situation. And he said, I appeal to Rome. And the amazing thing was, when he spoke to the soldiers at the temple, he spoke to them in Greek. And when he addressed the people, he spoke to them in Aramaic, which is a form of Hebrew. He was bilingual, at least, maybe more than that. He probably knew some Latin, being a Roman citizen, and all that. He was able to use it for his benefit. Now, the other thing about it is that I heard a man saying years ago, he talked about a man, and it wasn't D.L. Moody, I don't think, it might have been D.L. Moody, but I don't think it was D.L. Moody, I think it was another man, and he saw a drunk on the street, and he told a friend, he said, there but for the grace of God, go I. Now, I've heard that phrase said many times, there but for the grace, but there's some truth to it. There's some truth. We don't know what might have happened to us, what we could have become, had it not been for God and His grace in our lives. We didn't attain it by pulling up our boots and walking out. We attained it by God lifting us up, reaching out a hand to help us, and asking us to reach out a hand to help another. But for the grace of God, go on. We all make many mistakes. We all need to know what forgiveness is, and we also all need to know what it is to give it as well. All right, enough for that lesson today. We'll pick it up next week in the month of July. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for this day that you've given to us, and your grace to us in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, see you next week, folks.